Mark didn't just break our marriage. He sold my family's history for a weekend with another woman. The jade pendant had belonged to my grandmother, 200 years old, carved by hand during the Qing dynasty and passed down through generations of women in my family. To most people, it looked like a beautiful antique necklace resting inside a velvet-lined box. To collectors, it was something very different. A documented historical artifact worth more than $2 million. But Mark didn't see history, he saw quick money, and when he pawned it to pay for a luxury ski trip with his secretary, he thought he was walking away with the best deal of his life. What he didn't realize was that some objects carry more than value. They carry records, ownership trails, insurance documentation, and when that jade pendant resurfaced at an international auction 18 months later with an estimated value of $2.4 million, the auction house didn't call him, they called me. But the story didn't begin at an auction. It began on a quiet Sunday morning. The house felt unusually silent that day. Mark had already left for work, or at least that's what his message claimed. The sunlight drifted through the bedroom curtains while I opened the antique wooden jewelry box on my dresser. The velvet slot where the jade pendant should have been was empty. At first I thought I had misplaced it. I searched the drawer, then the bathroom counter, then every jewelry case I owned. But something inside me already knew. The jade had never left that box in 20 years, and it had never left my bedroom, unless someone took it. I walked slowly into Mark's home office. His desk was messy as always. Coffee cups, receipts, paperwork scattered everywhere. And right in the center of the desk sat a small white slip of paper. A pawn ticket, the name of the shop, an item description, green pendant, loan value, $18,000. $18,000 for something worth $2.4 million. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at the paper. My grandmother had once told me that the jade pendant carried the strength of every woman who protected it before me. At that moment, I wondered if she had meant patience instead, because I didn't scream. Didn't call Mark hot, instead I opened my phone, and that was when the second betrayal appeared. Mark had posted a photo on Instagram. He was standing in first class beside a woman with long blonde hair, both of them smiling with champagne glasses in their hands. The caption read, "Much needed getaway." The ski resort behind them was in Switzerland, a 5-star luxury resort, a place that required far more than $18,000 to enjoy properly. My jade pendant had funded their celebration. I looked back down at the pawn ticket on his desk. Then I folded it quietly and slipped it into my purse. I packed one suitcase, not out of anger, out of clarity. Some confrontations only give people a chance to lie. So instead of waiting for Mark to return, I left the house without a word. That afternoon, I filed a theft report. The jade pendant wasn't just sentimental property. It was documented, heritage jewelry with recorded provenance. That meant something important. Once it entered official heritage databases, it could never be legally sold without triggering alerts. Collectors knew it, museums knew it, auction houses knew it, and eventually, someone else would know it too, Mark. But by the time that realization reached him, the trap would already be set. *18. Months passed. During that time, my life became very quiet. Mark moved in with his secretary shortly after I left. According to mutual friends, their relationship burned through money quickly. Luxury trips, designer purchases, a new apartment, but affairs built on excitement rarely survive real life. Eventually she left him, and by the time that happened, most of the money was gone. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding. New apartment, new routines, and one very important habit. Every month I checked international auction catalogs, because eventually the jade pendant would resurface. Objects like that don't disappear forever. Collectors talk, dealers move pieces quietly through networks, and sooner or later someone tries to sell. One evening, while browsing an auction catalog from Hong Kong, I finally saw it, Lot 47, Qing Dynasty, Imperial Jade Pendant. Provenance, private European collection, estimated value, $2.4 million. I stared at the photo on the screen. The jade was unmistakable. Deep emerald green, carved phoenix, gold clasp from the 1800s. My grandmother's pendant. My phone rang the next morning. "Good morning," a calm voice said. "This is Victor Liang from Liang International Auction House. Yes, we believe you may be the legal owner of a jade pendant currently listed in our upcoming sale." I allowed a small smile. "Yes." He paused. "We discovered your ownership report in the International Registry. I registered it 18 months ago. We would like to return the item to its rightful owner before the auction proceeds. That would be appropriate." He lowered his voice slightly. "There is one complication." "What kind?" "Someone has already contacted us, claiming rights to the piece." I didn't need him to say the name. Mark Bechter continued. "He says he legally pawned it and therefore the ownership transferred." "And what did you tell him?" "That stolen property cannot legally be sold." Silence hung on the line. Then he added something unexpected. "Our auction is in 3 days. I'm aware, if you attend, we would like to resolve the matter publicly." I thought about that for a moment. Then I agreed. The auction house ballroom in Hong Kong was filled with collectors, investors, and journalists when I arrived. The jade pendant sat under a spotlight inside a glass display case. Lot 47. My grandmother's legacy. Across the room, I spotted Mark almost immediately. He looked older, thinner, but his expression was still filled with the same arrogant confidence. Beside him sat the woman he had left me for. She was scrolling through her phone, clearly bored. Mark was smiling. He thought he was about to become rich. The auctioneer stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome." The bidding moved quickly through the first few items. Then the room quieted. "Next we have Lot 47. The jade pendant appeared on the large screen behind him. Mark leaned forward eagerly in his seat, but the auctioneer did not begin the bidding. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, there is an important legal update regarding this item." Murmurs spread through the room. "This artifact has been identified as stolen property belonging to a registered private owner." Mark's smile disappeared. "Therefore, Lot 47 has been withdrawn from sale and returned to its rightful legal heir." Mark shot to his feet. "That's impossible." Security immediately stepped toward him. "You can't do this," he shouted. "I sold that piece." "Yes," the auctioneer replied calmly. "And that is precisely the problem." Mark's eyes moved upward toward the VIP balcony above the auction floor, and that's when he saw me, standing quietly holding the jade pendant in my hand. For a long moment he simply stared. Shock, rage, realization, every emotion crossed his face. At once, the woman beside him looked at him with sudden confusion, then with disgust. Within seconds, security escorted him toward the exit. He kept shouting as they dragged him away, but his voice faded quickly as the doors closed behind him. The room fell silent again. Victor approached me quietly. "I believe this belongs with you." I looked down at the jade pendant resting in my palm. It felt exactly the same as it had in my grandmother's hands. Years earlier, some inheritances travel through blood, others travel through patience. Mark believed he had sold a necklace. What he actually sold was his future. And sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply waits for the gavel to fall. Asterisk. For a moment, the auction hall remained completely silent. Hundreds of people had just witnessed the end of a very expensive illusion. Mark was still shouting somewhere outside the main doors, but the sound had already faded into the distance. The collectors in the room slowly returned their attention to the stage, but many of them kept glancing toward the balcony where I stood. They weren't interested in the jade anymore. They were interested in the story, because moments like that are rare. A Man who thought he was about to receive millions had just discovered he owned nothing. Victor Liang approached me quietly with a respectful nod. Your grandmother had extraordinary taste, he said. I looked down at the pendant resting in my palm. The jade caught the light softly, the carved phoenix glowing like it had its own quiet fire. My grandmother always said jade protects the person who protects it, I replied. Victor smiled. Then it seems she was right. Downstairs, the auction resumed. New items appeared under the spotlight, and the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm of bidding paddles and quiet murmurs. But my part in the evening was already finished. I stepped away from the balcony and walked toward the private lounge behind the auction floor. A few minutes later, Victor joined me again. We've already completed the legal transfer paperwork, he said, placing a small folder on the table. The pendant is officially back under your ownership record. Thank you. He hesitated for a moment. If you ever decide to sell it, there are several museums that would pay extraordinary sums. I closed the velvet case gently. I didn't come here to sell it. He nodded, understanding immediately. Some objects aren't meant to become transactions. They are meant to remain exactly where they belong. Later that evening, as I stepped outside the auction house, I saw Mark standing near the curb. The woman, who had once been his perfect escape, was nowhere in sight. She had already left the moment the security guards escorted him out. He looked tired, angry, embarrassed, but mostly defeated. When he saw me walking toward the car, he stepped forward. Wait. His voice sounded very different now, quieter, almost fragile. You ruined me, he said. I stopped beside the car door. No, I replied calmly. You did. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know it was worth that much. That wasn't the problem. He looked down at the pavement, then back at the pendant case in my hand. You could have told me. For a moment I considered that statement. Then, I shook my head. If someone needs to know the price of something before they decide whether to respect it, I opened the car door, then they were never going to respect it in the first place. Mark didn't respond. There was nothing left for him to say. I stepped into the car and closed the door. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked down at the small velvet case resting in my lap. My grandmother once told me that jade carries the memory of every generation that protects it for 200 years. It had protected me, not through revenge, not through anger, but through patience. Because sometimes, until the truth finally rises to the surface, and when it does,